I am Norma Brandenburg Hayes, and it is my pleasure this morning to interview a World War II veteran from the U.S. Maritime Service, otherwise known as the Merchant Marine, who is named Lambert Waltman.
Right.
And Mr. Waltman was born on the July the 7th, 1930, in 1920.
No, July the 30th.
July the 30th, 1920. And he was born in Sims, Alabama, and he still lives in the Mobile area.
Yeah, right.
And he has quite a story to tell about his time in the Merchant Marine. He started out as a deck cadet with Waltman Steamship. And what do you have to say about that?
Well, it was just doing anything they wanted me to do. Chipping rust, painting. Once a week, got up on the smokestack and shined the brass whistle.
Did you have to do any other chores of any consequence?
No, it was mostly working with the deck crew, maintenance, upkeep. Back then, they used to fish oil the decks. It was always fighting rust on the old ships. Later on, when I was sailing with Likes after the war, the ships had to, they call it the met coat. Steel was treated where it wouldn't rust too bad. But I mean, there was a constant fight. You could chip and paint, put red lead to stop the rust from coming through. And then if you had heavy weather coming back from Europe, it would start to bleed again. I mean, bust out and do it all over again. But they used to try and make a good presentation when they arrived back. But if you had real rough weather, the rust would pop through.
Well, I would like to know about what reason you had for deciding to join the branch of the service known as the Merchant Marine.
Well, like I said, I tried to join the Navy, and they said my chest didn't expand enough, and I went to the YMCA and built my chest up. Went back, and the doctor examined me, said I had a heart murmur. So then, because I had 2 years of typing at Murphy, the NYA, National Youth Administration, which was the same as the WPA, the Works Progress, but it was for the young people. And they put me down at the Department of Commerce office on Conti Street, right in back of Sears. Sears used to be on the corner of Royal and Conti. And there's a small office, Department of Commerce, that issued Siemens papers. And when they went in there, Captain McAllister, he had went to sea for a while, but he wasn't a captain. They called him captain. Later on, he was the shipping commissioner, United States shipping commissioner, who came down to the ships and signed the crews on. You had to have a shipping commissioner, make allotments and all that. But anyhow, he put me to work at taking World War I shipping sheets from the old War Shipping Board, and he wanted to make orderly files, index files like, and I made cards for him. I was working on that, and these seamen come in, and he was very inquisitive, asked where they'd been and everything. And he said, he'd carry on. I'd listen, and I asked him to give me Siemens paper, and he said, I want you to finish these files, and then I'll give you paper. Well, he gave me papers, and I went down and tried to get a job myself several times. And he said, I'll get you a job. And so I was helping my father do carpenter work. I was putting flooring down in a building, and they called that day, and it was the 17th of July, 1939, and said, McAllister said he had a job for me on the City of Alma, watermanship, his deck cadet, $1 a day. So I threw my hammer down and took off, and we sailed at 6 p.m. for London.
And so from then on out, you were in the Maritime Service until what year?
Until 1981.
Well, golly,
I sailed when after I made that trip to Europe. They took the cadets off the ship because of wars. War was, we weren't in the war, but they were sinking American ships before we ever got in the war. And they put me on a ship going to Puerto Rico as a cadet. And so it was two ships. I was a SS Bienville. That was a short trip to Puerto Rico. And I came back, and shipping commissioner told me again that he would get me a job. And he called me one day and said he had a job on a Standard Oil Saucony vacuum tanker as a messman, saloon messman, serving the officers. And I went on there, and we ran between New York and Texas. I stayed on there 7, 8 months. Went to the World's Fair up in New York, 1940. And I think that was the year, 1940, the World's Fair. And then while I was on there, I joined the union, which it was hard to get in the union back then. But if you had a job, like on the tanker, they would take you in as a member because they were always fighting. Back then, the NMU and SIU were fighting for members. And if you were on a tanker, you could get membership in the union. So I joined the SIU. And after that, I could ship out to Union Hall, and I made several trips, messman, mess boy. Made one trip as wiper, but I quit it down in Puerto Rico. But it's too hot down there in the engine room. And I sailed various jobs, and then I mainly concentrated on deck. And then right at the end of the war, I was on the Alcor ship. I made quite a few trips down to the Caribbean. And at Pearl Harbor, had got off the Alcor Voyager in Philadelphia, coming back from the Caribbean, and the Japs bombed Pearl Harbor. And then I came to Mobile and got my able-bodied seaman certificate and the lifeboat ticket to sail able-bodied seaman. And then when I had enough time, I think I made the last trip on a passenger ship to I had made a trip as messman on the Del Sud, but on the Del Argentina, I believe it was. And it was a passenger ship. And that was AB. And then real interesting trip, the next trip, as an AB, I went to the California and shipped out, and the ship was already loaded with bombs, and we went to Brisbane, Australia. That was my last trip as an AB, but when we got to Brisbane, they needed some Aussie troops transported up to Port Moresby, New Guinea, and they decided to make a troop ship out of us. We carried 550 Aussie troops from Brisbane to Port Moresby, New Guinea. And they had these poor Canadian soldiers that just came back from fighting in North Africa against Rama, And Japs were about to overrun the mountain there in New Guinea, and they needed troops in a hurry, so they converted this Liberty ship I was on. It was a Thomas Jefferson. I was able-bodied seaman on there. They converted it in a troop ship, which they built big ladders down into the hold, and then on the deck they built a wooden shack for a latrine, and and they run a fire hose to the latrine, running over the side. And the Aussie soldiers slept in the hose. Well, it's just a short run, a couple of days up to New Guinea. But those poor Aussies, they didn't have much time off. They had been in the desert in North Africa fighting. And when we got up to Port Moresby, they had a little band, and they marched right off the ship and up into the mountains in combat.
My goodness. Well, was the primary function of the vessels that you served on related to transporting troops and equipment?
That was the only ones I ever. They made made a temporary trade troop ship out of it. Now it's all cargo mostly.
But what did the
Bombs mostly.
bombs?
Nearly
Okay.
during the, except when I was on that ship, chief mate, I was telling you, we were carrying aluminum ore from South America to Philadelphia, New York. But that's when they were sinking a lot of ships.
Well, there have been some questions, I know, from other branches of the service about what the true contribution of the merchant marine was to World War II. Do you have any comments to make about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a little known fact that the merchant marine, I've got some papers here that has the figures. Merchant marine had the second highest casualty rate next to the Marine Corps.
Oh, my goodness.
And I mean, I've got some articles here to back that up. And they had, I mean, that's proportionally, you know. We had, next to the Marine Corps, had more casualties. They sunk 400 merchant ships in the first 6 months of the war, 400. And I think there was over, I've got figures in my papers there, that there was almost 700, almost 800 merchant ships sunk, and a bunch taken prisoners, some died in captivity. And they put guns on the ship, and we had a small Navy gun crew on those ships. We would probably 16 men. We had probably 20 millimeters, 2 on the bow, 2 on the stern, and 2 up on the wing of the bridge. I think we had 8. I had a 3-inch gun on the bow and a 5-inch on the stern. But I never was on the ship that fired them all during the war. They used to practice. Oh, it was comical down in New Zealand when I was down there that year. The gunnery officer, his name was Fabius W. Harrison. He was some kind of economics teacher at the University of Wyoming. Back then, the first of the war, if you had 2 years of college, they would send you to school for 90 days in the Navy, and then you were a 90-day wonder. And they made you an officer in the Navy. This guy, I'm telling you, Fabius W. Harrison, he was a character. He didn't know latitude from longitude. I'd be on watch, and he'd see a plane or something. He'd come running in and say, "Hey, mate, what's the position?" I'd tell him certain latitude, and way out by the international date line, when you go up to 180 degrees. And the latitude don't go to no figures like that. He didn't even know what it is. He said, "Is that latitude or longitude?" And then when we got down to Christchurch, New Zealand, he got friendly with some New Zealand aviators, and they agreed to tow a target sleeve for him in an old biplane. And when we sailed, all at once this whole plane coming out tying this, towing this big target sleeve, and he didn't synchronize the guys shooting these 20 millimeters, and they had tracers, you know, every 10th one or something, it's red hot, and you can see it. It makes a line like. And he let all these 8 millimeter guns cut loose at one time, and you could see tracers going all around this New Zealand plane. And then he took off, and he's cussing. He's saying, "God," he said, "he promised to tow him for me." I said, "Well, hell, you almost shot him down. He's not crazy." No, I never will forget him. And most of them were good guys, but he was something else.
Well, speaking of Fabius, did you form a lot of friendships among your fellow seamen, or have any of those friendships lasted over these years that you have stayed in contact with these people, or joined any organizations that have kept you in contact with them?
Yeah, I belonged to a group of engineers and mates, and attended meetings with hell the whole time. We used to meet, And same with the Murphy High School class. It's just breaking up now. It used to be 25, 30. Now there's me and one lady and another lady going
When were you graduated from Murphy?
in June of 38.
And then you, right shortly, joined up with Merchant Marine.
Yeah, in
correct?
July the next year.
Yes. Okay. Were you able to keep in communication with your family, your folks back home while you
Oh,
were
yeah.
serving in the service?
Oh yeah, you had a box number through the Navy. We got pretty good mail service. The services really tried to get the mail to the seamen.
Well, when you were at sea, did you have any hobbies that, when you were not busy doing your
Yeah,
duties, did you have some hobbies that you engaged in?
my urologist asked me, "What do you do on the ship?" I said, "I memorized poetry, and I still know
Interesting.
plenty of poetry." He says, "What'd you do?" And I said, "Well, at night on the bridge, and you're walking back and forth, you're out in the middle of the Pacific, and you might see a ship in 10 days, and you might not. And I used to take poetry that I liked, a few verses, take a flashlight, walk back and forth on the bridge, check the steering wheel. Most of the time it was on automatic steering, but we had a man at the wheel. And used to just repeat going over, and I memorized a lot of poetry.
Do you remember most of it?
Yep, a lot of it.
Well, now, did that result in
Especially
your...
Omar Khayyam. Have you ever?
Oh, yes, I'm familiar with Omar Khayyam. Well, did that result in your becoming a poet yourself?
No, I just like to hear, I like rhythm in poetry, like Longfellow, Walt Whitman, no. But,
Well, after the war, do you remember where you were when the war was officially concluded?
with the Japanese and the Germans.
Yes.
With the, let's see, the Germans surrendered first, didn't they? Yeah. I was in New York when the last day, and I was shipping out on the. I had just joined I came back from. No, wait a minute. Let's see. I had went to New York, and I was in New York when the war ended in Europe. And right after that, I went to the, I was on a Liberty ship, and then I had got kind of mad with Waterman because they had promised me a new ship, and they didn't give it to me, so I had went to New York, and anyhow, I met the guy that I'd sailed with. He was boatswain, and he was getting off the Matic at his chief mate said he's going to get his captain's license, and he begged me to go up and so take his job. Well, I went up to the Waterman office, and the port captain tried to give me a job on a Liberty ship again, and I refused it. So he took my name, and I went back to the hotel, and the next morning he called me and he gave me the job on this newer ship to Madigan. And we were in the, just came out of the Red Sea when the war ended, and we were bound for Calcutta with a whole load of Army cargo. And we got to Calcutta and discharged. We had an Army security officer on that too, and a naval officer with a gun crew. We stayed a pretty good while in Calcutta, and we got the day we got cleared, we were going to sail to Cape Town empty to get cargo there. When suddenly they changed orders, and that afternoon we were supposed to sail, and said we're going to take Army cargo up to Shanghai. Well, that was interesting. That was the war had ended when we were bound for Calcutta.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people don't believe that Truman did right by dropping the atom bomb, but if you could have seen when we left Calcutta with a load for Shanghai for the Army, up in Shanghai, when we got down to the Singapore Straits, I never saw so many ships in my life anchored there. They were very close to invading Japan, and if they had ever invaded Japan, there would have been countless deaths because the Japs wouldn't quit, you know. And just a huge, and they were all loaded with cargo for the invasion of Japan. And we got up to Shanghai, and there were still Japanese troops on the dock, waiting to be repatriated. And we stayed there a good while, and it ended up, we made a trip around the world with that ship. We started in New York, and then we sailed from Shanghai back to the West Coast, and then went coastwise around back to New York.
Well, I'd be interested.
But the war in Europe, I'm kind of confused now. I know I was, yeah, the war ended while I was in New York, and I went on this ship, and I remember we were in a convoy because it was mines still off of in Belgium. I mean, up in Rotterdam and in the North Sea, there were still minefields. And one ship in the convoy, we had a little convoy. Even though war was over, they were still making us get in convoys because of the danger of the minefields. And one Liberty ship hit a mine and sunk right there, but at the tops of the mast, the water was kind of shallow, and the tops of the mast, you could see it sticking out. Well, we just kept going.
Well, how did all of those experiences affect your later life? You're having been there in the midst of all of that destruction and all of that war, and having seen your log and knowing how many places that you had been in service during World War II, how do you think that subsequently has affected your life?
It didn't bother me too much. I'm a fatalist. I always thought what will be, and I never did worry too much during the war. And some guys, I just would have walked the deck with the life preserver on, but I'd go to sleep and sleep soundly because there wasn't nothing to worry about, because if something gonna happen, it's gonna happen.
Well, would you say that would be one of the lessons or the impact that the war had on you and your future life? Was your philosophy that of being fatalistic about everything? What is to be will be? Yeah.
Well, I just it got to, after the war, it got to be, it was a pretty good job, and when the jobs got scarce, the union started rules to, we would work about 6 months and then have to take 6 months off, and we got paid for most of that time off. It was pretty good.
Well, during that period of time when you were away from the ship, what were you engaged in carpentry work with your father, or what?
When I was what?
Well, you had said earlier that you had been engaged in carpentry work with your father. Did you continue carpentry during the time away from the ship?
No. Well, I did build. I had a lot over at Lagoon, Brigadoon, and Gulf Shores, and I got a fellow that had built my carport, and he said he'd never built a house on stilts, and I got him to start building me a cottage there on my lot in the Lagoon. I bought that lot for $1,250, and later on, back here a few years ago, they had me taxed for worth $250,000 for a 50-foot lot on Brigadoon. Anyhow, I'd got this colored fellow myself, and I helped him. I had to go. I kept telling him I wanted to get started because I had to go back on my ship when it came back. And he said his helper was sick, so I said, I'll be your helper because I'm going to buy the material every day. And I think I took $5,000 and we roughed this cottage in. And it took me 7 years to complete it. Every time I get off the ship, I go over there with my wife and stay and work. And I never, well, I did a little carpenter work with my dad. But I did, after we finished it outside, it took me, that was in 73. And I just finished working on it when Frederick came. And I did the plumbing, the electrical, after I had the electrician run box inside, and all the plumbing, not sheetrock, paneling. I did all of that. I didn't think I could do the plumbing, but the guy at Southern Pipe Company, he said, I'll lay it all out, and I bought me a book. Anyhow, I did all the work on it and just finished it when Frederick come, and I shipped out on the Elizabeth Likes and got over to Houston and called my wife, and Frederick had done, she went over there and it took the whole darn thing away.
Well, how
All I had left was the piling
my goodness.
and the steps. Oh yeah, and they fell up the street from me. He said he's kind of tongue-tied, he's hair-lipped. He said, I'm gonna see him in the Waltman, see what kind of nails he using them steps. Did you acquire a lot of the skills when you had the period of time when you were in civilian life? Were a lot of those skills related to what you had learned when you were in the maritime service? Or did you No.
start out with those and just carry those with you to the merchant marine?
No, I just, I don't know. I didn't work too long with my dad, but he was back a carpenter when he really worked, because today they got all these darn tools. Back when he was carpentering, it was just hand sawing and drilling with hands and all that. Carpenter really worked hard back in those days.
Well, did you have siblings who were in the service as well as you?
Excuse me. No.
You were the only one in your family.
No. Oh, yes. Yeah, my older brother was in the army, in the trenches in Germany. He's 6 years older than me. And my younger brother, he was in the Navy.
So you kept contact with them throughout the war?
Yeah. My younger brother, later on, he got out of the Navy. Well, once when he was in the Navy in Taiwan, no, not in Taiwan, Okinawa. I had been on that another Liberty ship, and he knew I was on there. We used to correspond, and he went aboard the ship, and I just got off of it. And then later, after the war, he was living in Puerto Rico. He married a Puerto Rican girl. And my ship went into San Juan, and he came down and had dinner with us.
Well, did you have occasion to be able to see much of the world when you were off of the ship? I mean, when you were in port, did you have very many activities that you engaged in?
Oh yeah,
Like touring the world, touring the area and so
I
forth?
wasn't too hip on, a lot of guys would go inland. I went, in my little book there, I've got all the ports I visited and countries, about, I think it's 97 different countries. And hundreds of
97?
ports, yeah.
Oh my goodness.
And 78 American ports. And until I started counting them, you wouldn't think that, and I didn't go to all of them, but there's so many little ports that you don't even hear about or know about. You think of New York, Philadelphia, San Francisco, Seattle. But I can show you in my little book, I had 78 American ports that I visited when I went to sea.
And then abroad, how many did you have?
Well, when I went after the war, when I was on a grain carrier I made 2 trips to Israel, I was curious about the holy places, and I made the tour. You can go all over Israel in no time. And I went to Jerusalem, and I went 2 trips to Haifa on the ship. But you could go all on these tours and go all over Israel.
Were you well received in those ports abroad, as were the other servicemen in the other branches of the service?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
They held the merchant people in high esteem, as well as the Navy and the Army and the other services.
Even though during the first part of the war, it never was any uniforms. In the Merchant Marine, it wasn't strictly like all this saluting and stuff. Even though I had a lieutenant commander's rating, when I was out in the Pacific the whole year as third mate, Captain used to send me to naval supply ships to get stores, When we'd run out of stuff, the representative from the Warshipping Administration would give the captain an order, and we could go aboard a Navy transport ship for supplies. But all I had was, like when I was with Waterman, I had an officer's hat with the Waterman W on it and everything, and that was before I got into the lieutenant and all with the Maritime Commission. But the captain sent me one day to the naval supply ship to get stores, and I took the crew, and I had my Waterman cap on, officer's cap. And I went aboard, and he said, have your boat stand off, your lifeboat, and get them back when you get to stores. So they escorted me down into Four Peak stores. And when I come back up, I finished getting the order together. There was officers, all the crew was lined up, and some officer there, and there was 2 officers there. And I walked up to this lieutenant, and I said, I want to get my lifeboat. He said, stand at attention, there's high-ranking officers aboard. I said, what? Stand at some admiral or captain or something was visiting this ship, and they were lined up in a rotation, and all this stuff with rank and everything was foreign to me. And I said, he said, stand at attention, there's high rank. And I said, listen, I just want to get my groceries and get off of here. So I stood back, and I didn't stand at attention like all them. And finally, after he got off, I got my boat alongside and got the groceries and took off. But that was funny during the war. We didn't have all that protocol and saluting and stuff like that.
But you still did an outstanding contribution to the war effort. And
well, I guarantee you, if there wasn't any Merchant Marine, there wouldn't have been any war, because the Navy and the Army doesn't have supply ships. They have just a few. But we had I think there was 700 and something ships. No, 2,700, I believe, Liberty ships built during the war. That first ship that I went third mate on in San Francisco, I first went to American President Lines, because my last trip as AB, the one that they made a troop ship out of it, I had sailed with American President Lines, but they didn't have a ship, so I went up to Sutton and Christensen in San Francisco, and they were the agents for Waterman. And right away, the captain of the ship department, he was up there. He was a German-born fellow named Fulner. And they said, yeah, we got you a job on a Liberty ship. And the captain said, go over to the Richmond shipyard and familiarize yourself with this ship. When I went over there the next morning, they were still building the ship. It was a Liberty ship. They built them in sections. And they were building them in, I forget, a month, 2 months or something. They were turning them out like crazy. So I spent a couple of weeks watching them put finished touches on that ship. Then right away they rushed it to have it degaussed. That's taking the magnetism out of it. And then stored up and loaded bombs and took off. I didn't know where we was going. And when the captain didn't, he waited about 2 weeks out at sea before he told us where we was going to the Hebrides. We had cargo for Guadalcanal, but they kept bombing it, and we never did get to Guadalcanal. Ended up in Noumea, which is was a staging area. That's a French island off the coast of Australia. And that was a big army staging area. And we discharged some of our bombs there and then went down to 3 ports in New Zealand. Finally got them off in Littleton, which is the port for Christchurch. And that's the biggest city, I think, further south than any city port. That's a big city. That's the jumping off place for all the activity that goes on in the South Pole. You know, all the anything that's doing, that's the jump off place.
Well, I wondered if you were ever on any of the Liberty ships that were constructed in the Mobile shipyard.
No, I was my mother in 42, my mother died. She was only 50 years old, and she had cried so much and worried about me going to sea during the war, and I quit for about a month, and I got a job over at the shipyard, and that was before she died. And then after she died, I quit. I didn't work over. I got a job as timekeeper over there, where they were building tankers, T2 tankers. And after my mother died, I said, I'm going back to sea, because they would have drafted me in here.
Well, I was so glad that you told me about your honor of going to Washington with the honor flight.
Yeah.
And that Governor Riley was your companion. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, it was great. I didn't even think about applying because I wasn't considered a veteran. I mean, hell, it took us 45 years after the war ended before the Merchant Marine was recognized as gave veteran status. But I finally, I applied, and right away I was accepted. And when I went to the orientation at Fort Whiting, one of the ladies, they were dividing us up in 3 buses. It was going to be red, white, blue. This was 2 weeks before we left. And the lady took me to the table that I was going to sit. She said, Bob Riley is going to be your guardian. I said, Bob Riley? Is that the governor? And she said, I don't know. And then another lady come over there later, and I asked her. I said, who's going to be my guardian? Me and one other guy. They guardians with 2 different soldiers, veterans. And then the next lady, she said, yeah, that's Bob Riley. Aren't you lucky? And I said, well, why in the hell was I picked to be with him? And I was with him from 6 in the morning till 8:30 that night. Ate with him all day, went to the bathroom with him all day. And then after we got back, he wanted to meet my people, and they were at the airport, and he invited us up to Montgomery to have lunch with him.
How nice.
And I think it was Bonner, he gave me a flag that flew over the Capitol. You know, they run them up and run them down. And he gave me, he gave me a citation thing about the flag, a thing. And that state senator Glover, Rusty Glover, there was an article in the paper about me, and he sent me, and he's not even my representative. He's out towards Sims, and my representative is different, but he sent me 6 laminated copies of that newspaper article, and it's got a picture of me and the governor and the other guy that was the veteran that was there.
Well, you and all of the merchant people were very, very fortunate to finally be recognized, and it has certainly been my pleasure to interview you today in Fairhope, Alabama,
Yeah.
and the date of today is the 26th of April. And I know that the Library of Congress is most appreciative to you and to all of the veterans who served our country so nobly during World War II. And thank you so much for being with us
Well,
today.
thank you, and it was a pleasure. Is this on film? All in-
We're going
Thank
to
you, Brandy. That
make a
was
DVD of it
wonderful.
eventually, and you'll get a copy.
Oh, yeah? Yeah, I had finally Booth there, he sent a copy of the DVD on the thing.
Of the trip.
And I had, prior to that, I'd had a 90th birthday party, I don't know how they kept it from me, but down at Windsor, my daughter-in-law, she invited 85 people. She invited people in my subdivision that I didn't even know. I've been living there 47 years. But I walked in there that afternoon, and she really got over 200 pictures. She had a professional photographer taking pictures. We got a book this thick with pictures in it. That was some birthday party.
Well, it was just wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
Your story and your personality, you bubble all
Oh,
over the
I
place. Isn't
know
he
it.
wonderful?